Well, I think we are live. I have no idea why that camera is doing that. It seems like when you get everything set in the right way, something happens and it doesn't work. Here I had a picture of me there with that's the Mediterranean Sea by Tel Aviv there. We're just going to go ahead with this camera like this. If you hope you don't mind being presented to by a ghost. So I have no idea why there's an automatic focuser that's not working there. And the lights are different than they were before too, I think. So anyway, those are things that'll have to be fixed. And I don't know how to do it on the fly here. Anyway, this is a program about Israel and Easter. And Israel, of course, is the land of the Bible. I was able to take a trip there last year, and it was kind of a life-changing experience. You know, I've been a minister and read the Bible all my life, read those stories of Palestine, but it's one thing to read the stories, it's another thing to read the stories again after you have been there and seen what it's like. You have to the pictures in your mind are completely replaced. It's a whole new book when you do that. So if you don't mind the ghost up there in the picture, we'll go right ahead. I'll fix that by next Friday, I hope. Anyway, this is Palestine. This is very, very old. This goes back probably 4,000 years. The gates up at Dan. Abraham, the great patriarch Abraham, probably walked through those very gates because it's recorded that he was up in this territory. This is the ancient city of Bethshan, as Jesus would have seen it. There were Roman ruins there that they've uncovered, and as you can see, it was a beautiful place. In the distance, you can see an amphitheater, and over on the right, there's a great colonnaded main street. An earthquake knocked all of this down, and it lay covered up for thousands of years, and they've recently excavated it. Behind it is the hill of Bethshan. When Saul and his sons were finally killed in a battle, Saul, the first king of Israel, the enemy took his body and fastened it to a wall up on top of that tell there that we're looking at in the background. A tell is an artificial mountain. And Saul's friends came in the middle of the night and they took the body down and took it back to Israel in a brave and daring thing. Here's a picture from up on top of that tell looking at the Roman ruins there. The Romans they were builders. They built all sorts of things and left plenty of evidence of their presence behind. It's just beautiful to think of what this city must look like. This, you may not, you may not recognize. That's a hill in the background there where there was an Israeli camp when a Philistine army across the valley to our right was attacking them. There was a huge giant that came from the right down into the valley, challenged the greatest warriors of Israel to battle. None of them accepted the challenge, but a little shepherd boy named David, when he saw that nobody else was going to fight that giant, he said, I'll fight the giant. He came down this little stream, dry creek bed in front of us called a wadi, and it runs along the base of that mountain where the Israeli camp was. It would have been right in this territory where David came down the hill and selected 5 smooth stones. He did it because this is where, when it rains, the water comes rushing down this channel and tumbles the rocks. It's just like one of those machines with a drum where you tumble the rocks in there to make them smooth. And so he found 5 stones that were smooth and perfect for his sling, and he defeated the giant. Here we are up on top of Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is where Elijah met the prophets of Baal and prophets of the Grove, 950 of them total, and had a contest by which he proved that there was only one God, the living God, who lit the fire in his altar when the others were unable to do so. I was driving through the countryside. I was reminded of the verse that in the Old Testament that said, the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It takes a bit of care to water the valleys of Israel, but the Israelis have done it. And where there used to be bare desert land, now there are crops growing and fulfilling the prophecy of the Old Testament. You can see this in the grocery stores. Look at all the fruit and the spices and the produce. All of this was produced in that tiny land of Israel, about 150 miles long from top to bottom, and some places not more than 20 miles wide. Of course, it was the land of Jesus. This is a mosaic I found in a modern church building on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, depicting Jesus inviting some fishermen to come and be his disciples and changing their lives forever. This is Bethlehem, of course, where Jesus was born. The story of Jesus, not counting all the prophecies in the Old Testament, of course, began in this little city. This is about 1860 in this picture. It's grown up quite a bit since then. We didn't visit Bethlehem. It was in Palestinian territory and not a real friendly place for our Jewish guide to be. But we did visit Nazareth. There you can see the signs in Arabic and Israeli and English. And we we went straight ahead there around that roundabout, and we went to Nazareth. There's Nazareth. Nazareth was Jesus' hometown. He was born in Bethlehem. He was only there because his parents came down there for a census and a taxing. And they went back home to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grew up. So Jesus saw these same hillsides and walked on them as he was a young man working in his father's carpenter shop. They had a living history place there that showed us what things were like back 2,000 years ago, with people acting the part of men and women that worked in the community. Here's a lady with her basket walking the hills there, and here's a lady that has her weaver's shop where she would put cloth together. Of course, they had no great textile factories. If they wore anything, it was made by themselves. And this is a carpenter shop, what they think a carpenter shop may have looked like back then. That young man is our guide for the village of Nazareth. He spoke excellent English. Found out he had gone to a Bible college in Tennessee, I believe it was, where some of my friends have gone to. I thought there was something special about him. He showed us this. They discovered a wine press on the grounds where they have the living history place. And this is an example of a wine press with that huge stone roller there, and they put the grapes in there, and they would crush them. He described how that they would crush the grapes, and then they would run them through the wine press again and get some more, and the difference between the first newly offered grape juice and the second pressing and the third pressing, and how some of the references that Jesus made to being pressed like those grapes were explained by that process. This, I couldn't resist sticking my fingers in this water. That is the water of the Jordan River. You know, when you look back in antiquity, the Jordan River in the stories of the Bible is just all over the Bible. The Jordan River flows down from the north. Its source is up on Mount Hermon, and runs down and comes through the Sea of Galilee and runs out down near Jerusalem, and then out into the Dead Sea. Never does get to the ocean. It evaporates and is used by irrigation long before that. But it was in the Jordan River, in a wide spot there. It says John, the prophet who preceded Jesus, who said, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord," was baptizing people in preparation for the coming of Jesus. It says he was baptizing in Enon near Salem because there was much water there. There aren't many wide spots on the Jordan River that are deep enough for that, but there's one. There's a picture of Karl Heinrich Bloch painting of the baptism of Jesus, what it might have been like. This is a wide spot in there, and it's a place where they built these facilities. A lot of people like the experience of being baptized in the same waters where Jesus was. So there's a wide spot there. No way of knowing, of course, if that was the actual place, but it's exciting to think it might be. Cana is the modern name of the village of Cana. And we know that Jesus, after spending his childhood in Nazareth, and after having his 40 days in the wilderness, began his ministry. He had done no miracles up until the time when he was 30 years old and began his ministry. But one day he went with his mother to a wedding, and the embarrassing thing happened to the young bride and groom, who were evidently poor. They ran out of wine. Oh, what a disaster. His mother looked at him and said, "They haven't any wine." That wasn't just a comment interesting comment. She looked at him like a mom, expecting her son to do something about it. And Jesus protested, "My time hasn't come." Sometimes our mothers know more about us than we do. And so Jesus said, "Oh, okay." And he had the servants at the feast bring pots of water. And then he said, "Take it to the master's ceremonies." And they did. When they poured it out, it was wine, the first recorded miracle. I think it's neat that Jesus, in his first recorded miracle, helped out a poverty-stricken young couple in that great moment in their lives. We didn't go to Cana, but there's a picture of it from 100 years ago, 1906, I think 114 years ago, with a camel. Let me tell you about camels. They made us go to this spot, and they had camels there, and they looked at us and said, "You want to ride a camel?" And the clear implication was, if you didn't ride that camel, you were some kind of chicken. Well, we rode the camels. I rode a camel. You know, when a camel sits on the ground, you get on it and it looks perfectly fine. But then he gets up and his back end gets up first while his front end isn't up. And you're tottering on the top of this growing mountain until he finally raises his front end when he's good and ready to do so. And in the meantime, you've been hanging on for dear life. And then you ride around and you just round in a circle there and hoping you don't fall off and embarrass yourself. And you're so glad when that camel finally puts himself down, repeating the process, of course, like you did before and threatening your life. I can't imagine how those people rode camels across the desert. One experience was enough. Anyway, this is Jacob's Well, one of the places in Palestine that you can go to where you know Jesus came. Jacob had his men dig this back thousands of years ago. Jesus went down there. It's in Samaria, where the Samaritans were, kind of half-breed Jews that were hated as a result by the Jews. Jesus went down there and waited at this very well until a young woman came along, a Samaritan woman, and asked her for a drink of water, which surprised her terribly because most Jews never touched a Samaritan, but Jesus did. And that began a sprightly conversation with that lively young woman, and she ended up being a great emissary for Jesus in her community, right on that spot. Here we are looking down from something called the Mount of Precipice. There was a story where Jesus was teaching a bunch of Israelis, and they took issue with something he said, and they grabbed him and took him up on top of a mountain where there was a cliff, and were going to throw him over, but he disappeared. Now, we don't know that this is the place, but that certainly is the sort of place, isn't it, where he could have been brought to the brink of that and escaped from them. Of course, the Sea of Galilee is kind of the centerpiece of a lot, Jerusalem and Galilee, but Galilee is one of the places where Jesus spent a lot of time. We call it the Sea of Galilee, but it's really just a big lake. I mean, we got many, many lakes in Minnesota. They're much bigger than this. They called it the sea because that was their word. They didn't need a word for lake. It was either a tiny bit of water or it was a sea. And this is the city of Tiberias where our hotel was. We spent 4 days there. But what a thought it was to think of Jesus out on a boat in this lake, seeing that you're seeing the same hills that he saw, you're going to the same towns that he went to. This is the same lake where Jesus was sleeping in the boat as his disciples were rowing across, and a storm came up. The waves were threatening to dump the boat over and drown them all. And they woke him up and said, "Master, the tempest is raging." Jesus got up and said, "Peace, be still." And all of a sudden the waters were glassy. Right on this very lake, right within our eyesight. When you look around, you see the whole thing. It's not a big lake. It happened right there somewhere. Here's a picture, another one of those mosaics, where one time Jesus came, the disciples were out in the boat, and Jesus came walking to them on the water. Peter, impetuous Peter, and faithful Peter said, "Tell me to come to you." Jesus did, and he began walking on the water until all of a sudden he got afraid and thought, what's going to happen if I drown? And for some reason that made him sink. Jesus grabbed him by the hand and pulled him up right on those very waters. This is a boat we went to see. It really has nothing to do with Jesus except it's back, according to their scientific investigation, from the time of Jesus. And it's just about the size of a boat, just probably the same make of a boat that Jesus and his disciples would have had to row around the Sea of Galilee. Fascinating to see it. Probably would have looked like this back in the days when they were keeping it all together. It was all in one piece. And it's just fascinating to see that, to think it was a craft much like that Jesus probably went in. But here is a spot. During Jesus' ministry, he went around to all the cities of Galilee. This is the town of Capernaum. Peter, the apostle, was from Capernaum. His mother had a house there. But they had a synagogue there, and Jesus taught in that synagogue. The interesting thing is that what we're looking at here are ruins from about 400 AD. But it was built on exactly the same site where the old synagogue was, where Jesus was. Just a few feet down is the original floor. You can see the dark rocks there. They built another floor on top of it. The dark rocks is the level where Jesus was. So when we're looking at this picture, you can imagine the young rabbi teaching, probably up there in the far end, and sitting there in a chair and teaching the people in Capernaum, right on this very spot. Just amazes me. This is probably one of my favorite places. I mean, it's just a little nondescript town of Magdala. Magdala was one of those little Galilean towns. It was the home of Mary Magdalene, Mary from Magdala. And since the Bible says Jesus went to all the cities of Galilee, it says he came here too. Now, when you look to the right up there, there are all these coverings. They're doing extensive excavations here. You know, there was dirt covering all of this, and they've been moving the dirt away and still discovering more things. The far wooden shelter, the less temporary one, is covering what they found in a bunch of ruins there. And it was a synagogue. Now this, back in Nazareth, they built this as a representation of what the synagogues probably looked like back at that time, because they have archaeological evidence, plenty of it, showing the common shapes of the things. And this is what it would have looked like inside. Walls would have been stuccoed and very nice, not quite so rough hewn. But under that shelter that we just looked at, this is the scene. This is their synagogue, going back to that day. They have archaeological evidence of the timing. It goes back to the time of Jesus. And this would have been the interior of the synagogue. There would have been, you can see some of the seats around the edges, an entrance over there on the left. And there would have been more seats coming up on the next level there. But since it says that Jesus went to all of the synagogues around that territory, I'm fairly certain that this is a spot. You can imagine Jesus probably sitting in a chair at the end at the right there, opposite the entrance, sitting there and talking to the men of this community. It just amazes me to think that this is a spot where Jesus himself stood or sat as he was conducting his ministry. It just felt like holy ground to me. Of course, Jerusalem is the centerpiece of Israel. And it was the center of Jewish worship back then, the capital of Israel. It was a center because it was the location of the temple. There you see that Muslim building, the gold dome of the rock there, situated on the Temple Mount. That was built back many, many years, I don't know, 1,200 years ago or something like that. Buildings lasted a long time. Jerusalem's a very modern city. See all those buildings. Those buildings weren't there in the time of Christ. That would have been bare hillsides up there. The streets of Jerusalem, in this old picture here, you can see them from, I don't know, this is like 80 years ago or something like that. But they look pretty much the same today. Of course, they've gotten color since then with modern photographs. The streets are little narrow things. The streets are still in the same place that they were in large measure back. Some of them are changed during the time that the Romans destroyed the city in 70 AD and built their Aelia Capitana on top of it. They tried to destroy a lot of it. But many of the streets are in exactly the same place they were in 2,000 years ago. And little narrow things. That's our guide in the blue coat on the right there. His name was Edo Keenan. He was a seventh generation Israeli. His family had been in Palestine for 7 generations, long before the Aliyahs of the last century in the 1900s. Look at those little narrow streets. I'm sure these shops have been there Somebody's had a shop in these same places for thousands of years. This is the supermarket there in Jerusalem. But of course, Jerusalem is where the temple is. This is the famous Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, as they call it. Beyond that wall, up on the top there, is the Temple Mount, where Solomon's temple was originally, and then Herod's temple. After Solomon's temple was destroyed, Herod the Great rebuilt the temple, and that's what was there during the time of Jesus. The Jews call it the Second Temple period. Now, the reason that this is a holy spot and not the ground on the Temple Mount itself is because the Jews, the religious Jews, were forbidden to set foot in the holiest, in the temple, in the holiest place in the temple, under pain of death. And since they don't know where the temple was exactly up there, they don't walk around on that part of the Temple Mount. But this is a wall they know. The stones on the lower courses there were stones that were put there by Herod and his engineers during the Second Temple period. Jesus would have seen these same stones as he walked around the temple there. And so this is a holy spot. You see a lot of people praying there. Over on the right, you see that there's a fence there. That's because the men are over on the left and the women are segregated over on the right, which I thought was fascinating. Not segregation by sexes is nothing new, but I thought it was fascinating how the ladies were congregating by the fence, peeking over to see what the men were doing. Isn't that a cute picture? Anyway, there was a street that ran along from the old city up to alongside the temple walls, and they've been excavating that street. It's underground. And there you can see the lowest courses of stones, the ones that were underground. This is an amazing one. Herod's engineers must have been something. Back to where the young man is standing, towards us, that's all one stone on the second level there. It's about 250 tons, 40 foot long and 6 or 8 feet wide, and 4 or 5 feet tall. Can you imagine how on earth could they move such a stone without modern equipment? But they did. They're all over in the temple there. And when you look at that line across here, that's the seam between two stones. It was so correctly, finely engineered that you can't get a piece of paper in between the two of those things. An amazing bit of engineering by the Israelis. This is the famous Holy Land Hotel model of Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. They've moved it to a museum grounds now. But you can see there the Temple Mount. This is the south end with those doors where Jesus and the disciples would have gone in. Over on the left side, in the back, you can see the fortress of Antonia, what they think that would have looked like. That was where the Roman soldiers had protected the Temple Mount. They were policemen, really, were. And then they had those arches coming down out of the side. Why wouldn't Jesus and the apostles have just gone in those arches? Why would they come around the south side? Well, because on the south side, they had baptistries, mikvah, they call them. It was the rule that you had to be clean when you went into the temple grounds. And clean meant washing ceremonially in a mikvah, which is where the water was running in and out, living water, as they called it. And so you would, if you were unclean because you'd been in the cemetery or something like that, you would wash and you'd be clean ceremonially. Then you'd go up into the temple and do your sacrificing and other things that were there. Now, that is a picture. You can see now that we've changed directions there. South is to the left. You can see that wall there with the Temple Mount above it. That's where the mikvah were in this territory here, and the doors were up in here. And we were up on the Mount of Olives, and we walked down. Apparently the streets are in exactly the same place they've always been. This is very probably the route that Jesus took when he was coming down towards the eastern gate that you see in the far distance to the right of the Dome of the Rock. The week before his crucifixion in what we call the Triumphal Entry, as he came down the mountainside riding on a colt, the foal of an ass, and the people began to see him, and they began to shout, and the crowds gathered, and they threw coats, and they threw palm branches in his way to make a soft platform for him to ride on. He went down the valley and up the hill in through that gate over there. There you can see the valley over on the right. He would have had to climb that hill to get to the eastern gate. Well, actually, this is the south end where the mikvah were. This is that south end where those triple doors were, and over to the left off the picture, double doors. This is where the pilgrims would have gone into the mount, and then I think they came the Temple Mount, and then I think they came out the double doors on the left. These are called the Huldah gates. Over on the right, you can see the corner of the temple. This is the highest spot on the temple walls. And as you stand below it and look up, it goes way up in the air. They found some archaeological inscription that indicated that this was called the pinnacle of the temple, which is interesting because if you've read about the temptations of Jesus, one of the temptations, it says Satan took Jesus up on the pinnacle of the table and said, "Test your Father God here by jumping down. Surely, if you're his son, he will save you. That'll prove you're who you say you are." And Jesus, of course, said, "The rule is, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." That could have been the spot. Of course, we don't know for sure. On the steps on that south end, they're leading up to those triple and double doors, are cut into solid bedrock. So we know these are the original steps. They covered them with the paving blocks you can see there. But it's fascinating to think you're walking on the same steps that Jesus, Peter, and John walked up to get in those doors. The doors have been bricked up. Now, a lot of the ancient gates have been bricked up around there, as we'll see. Here's a picture from probably 80 years ago, the Temple Mount from an airplane. Down at the bottom is where those doors were. This is before they excavated all those mikvah. Then you see the Mosque of Omar there, the Dome of the Rock. The temple was probably in the corner just right in there to the left of the Dome of the Rock, up in that corner. And the Fortress of Antonia would have been the buildings up in here where the soldiers were. This is on top of the Temple Mount. It surprised me. It was much bigger than I was thinking. Herod redid it all, but I think the stones are still in the same place as they were back then. I mean, the ground level still in the same place. This was a kind of a bit of jarring reality. Soldiers up on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is run by Muslim authorities, but order is kept by Jewish soldiers. And these aren't policemen that are just waiting to write you a ticket, to pull out their pad and write you a ticket if you violate some rule. These guys are ready for war, hands on the trigger even, because trouble does happen quite often up there, and it's nice to think there are guys up there to stop it if it happens. This is a police station up there on the mount, not far from that, the Mosque of Omar there. 2 weeks before we were there, somebody had thrown a firebomb inside that building there. So it's still very much a place where violence can break out. But this is a spot, that's our guide there, Edo Keenan. People don't know for sure where the temple was located, the temple of Herod, the second temple. But he's telling us why he thinks it's somewhere in this location. And it was a very good proof that was taken from some ancient Jewish writings. And because of that, there was a spot to the back there and down when we walked through that tunnel where the old road was. We came to a spot where there were a group of ladies and they're praying. And he's cautioned us to tiptoe very softly through there and not disturb them, because that was the closest spot to where the temple would have been above there. This is the famous Eastern Gate. The Eastern Gate was where Jesus came into the Temple Mount on his triumphal entry. We're looking at it from the inside. It's a spot, some controversy now. The Muslims want to make a temple out of this, a mosque out of it. Of course, that would close it off to any Westerners. Interesting knot of young Arab men up there. Didn't seem to have any purpose, kind of keeping an eye on it. I got the impression that trouble could have broken out at any minute. But that's an interesting gate. Here it is from the outside. Jesus would have seen it coming across the valley and climbing up that hill. But it's bricked up. This is what it looked like 100 years ago. Suleiman the Magnificent was an Ottoman emperor 500 years ago, and he really was magnificent. The best, I think he was the most magnificent of all the Ottoman emperors, Turkish rulers and Muslims. And he had read that prophecy in the Old Testament about the gate was reserved for the prince, meaning the Messiah. Of course, he did not believe in any Jewish Messiah, but he wasn't taking any chances. Now, I'm going to make sure that no prince ever goes through this gate, no young Jewish rabbi, and so he bricked it up. And then for good measure, they put a cemetery on the outside there. And the reason for that was that he figured that this young Messiah would be a rabbi. And a rabbi couldn't go into the temple if he'd just been in a cemetery. He was unclean. So you had to go to one of those mikveh. If you went to a funeral in a cemetery, you'd go to a mikveh and be washed before you went into the temple. By putting the cemetery right smack in front of the doors, though, there was no mikveh there. You couldn't ever get in there because you had to cross the cemetery to get to the doors. But the interesting thing is, got a little out of order here, if you read in Ezekiel 44, verses 1 through 3, Ezekiel said, "The Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut. It shall not be open, and nobody shall enter by it. It's reserved for the prince." So Suleiman, in his effort to prevent the Messiah from coming, actually fulfilled a prophecy. And we'll have to wait and see if the rest of the prophecy is fulfilled. Now, on the north end of the Temple Mount, they needed a lot of water for drinking, for those baptistries and things. And the water had to come from uphill. So they had some pools that were reservoirs, several of them right outside the temple grounds. And this one is Pool of Bethesda. You'll recognize that name from the Bible story where Jesus had gone outside the temple grounds to the pool, and there was a large congregation of crippled and maimed people who were there. The reason they were there is because the story was that there was a myth that whenever the waters rippled, that's because an angel had touched the water. And if an angel touched the water, it was magical. The first person in the water after the angel touched it would be healed. And so all these lame people and blind people, crippled people were sitting around there. Whenever the waters rippled, there was a mad dash to be first in the water. Well, Jesus found a lame man. He had known the lame man from before. And he asked a question, or a rhetorical question, said, "Why aren't you scrambling into the water?" And the man said, with a sense of frustration, I'm sure, he said, "I can't. I'm crippled. And by the time I get to the water, somebody else has always got in there. I'll never get to this place." And Jesus said, "Would you like to be healed?" You can almost hear the man saying, "Well, duh," but he must have said something, nodded his head or something. Jesus said, "Okay, take up your bed and walk." And for some reason, after he got done being incredulous, the man saw something in Jesus that made him obey. He stood up on his old crippled limbs. He wrapped up his bed and he walked away from the place where he had sat crippled for many, many years. Right at where we're looking there was where that took place. There's another pool down, if you go down the hill, along the ridge that is the old city of David they call it, and you get down to the bottom, there's another pool, and this is the famous Pool of Siloam. They've dug up part of that. It extended far it was a big pool to the left, and it was a reservoir. These weren't bathing, they weren't pools where you go swimming for recreation. They were reservoirs of water. And just to the right, on this big outcropping of rock, is where, back in that rock, there were tunnels. And here's one of them there. There had been tunnels dug in there in the days of the Jebusites, who were inhabitants of the place before David and the Israelites come. There was a tunnel dug by Hezekiah, and he describes digging it, because there was a source back in here of a spring called the Gihon Springs. And this is why they didn't build the temple in the time of David and Solomon up where it is now, because they had to be close enough to these springs for water. They dug the tunnels because when the Babylonians came by in the days of Hezekiah, he covered up the source of water. So the Babylonians wouldn't find it, and they dug tunnels through there so they could get to it when the Babylonians couldn't. And that supplied the water for the pool of Siloam and all the territory. That picture's out of order there. That's more the Temple Mount avenues there. Now, of course, at the end of the week that Jesus spent in Jerusalem, he knew that the Jewish authorities had gotten the Romans to be out looking for him. And the night that Jesus was betrayed, they had the Last Supper, and Judas got up in the middle of the supper and left. Jesus knew what he was doing, even though the rest of the apostles didn't. He was going to alert the Roman authorities of the location of Jesus. He knew Jesus was going up to the Mount of Olives, and so he went out secretly to tell the Romans. Jesus looked at him and said, what thou doest, do quickly. But then it says when they sung hymn, and they went out into the Mount of Olives, and they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now there's only, it's tough to connect things over a space of 2,000 years when they haven't always been kept track of well. But there's this garden here down towards the base, not quite all the way down, in a location where Jesus would have, coming from the old city of Jerusalem, coming across the valley and up into the Mount of Olives, it would have been very accessible to him. And there's a garden. I asked our guide, is the reason that that they think this is the Garden of Eden because there wasn't anything else around there? He said, yes. Well, it's pretty good evidence, I guess. That's one way you prove something, is prove that nothing else is there. But I think the evidence is you look at that and you say, was this a spot where Jesus and his disciples went, where he said to them, stay here, I'm going over there to pray? Took Peter, James, and John a little closer, but then he went off by himself. Would he have gone off and prayed and sweat, as it were, drops of blood at the end of that path or something like that? But why is it even a possible candidate for the Garden of Gethsemane? That's the reason. You don't grow a tree like that in 2 generations. That tree's thousands of years old. So there was a garden on this spot way back then. It's very likely, I suppose, that this was the spot. And it's just very, very hard to stand in that garden and try to picture the night when Jesus was betrayed. It would have been in this garden where Judas came and brought the Roman soldiers. And of course, soldiers didn't know what Jesus looked like. So Judas had told him, I'll kiss the one. Many other countries, when you're greeting, you kiss somebody on the cheeks. And Judas came up with the soldiers behind him, and he kissed Jesus on the cheeks. And the Roman soldiers grabbed Jesus and took him away. Could have happened right there where we're looking in this picture there. We, as we were coming down across the valley, met this family. How many kids? 6 kids in that picture. These were Americans taking their family over there. Knowing how much it cost for a plane ticket to get over there and back again, these family made quite an investment. But what a beautiful thing for these kids to begin their lives. When they read the stories of the Bible, they're going to have an accurate picture in their mind, and they'll be able to think, I've been on that spot. What a great gift by these parents to give to their kids. Anyway, the night when Jesus was betrayed, the soldiers took him, and they took him to the house of Annas, one of the 2 high priests. They had a Roman one and a Jewish one, and Caiaphas, and they took him to Pilate, and they took him to Herod. This is one of the main streets. They uncovered these stones and determined that this was one of the main streets. In fact, this is the major street between the lower part of the city and the upper part of the city. And it's fairly certain, I guess, that this would have been the route that those soldiers took when they dragged Jesus up to the house of Caiaphas. It's not a street in the sense, you couldn't drive a truck down that for sure. But there were many streets that were just for walking, not for any carts. There were steps in the streets. To the right is what they believe is the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas, the high priest of Israel. They believed that. There's a church built around there, and the path is up on the other side of that tree and column we see there. But here's some of the excavating that they did. And this isn't just a usual small house. This was obviously the house of some official, and it's in the territory where the house of Caiaphas would have been, according to ancient writings. It was special because it had a couple of mikvah in there, those ceremonial baptistries befitting a high priest of Israel. It also had a prison, a jail attached to it, way down under the ground. So this is a remarkable house, very, very much a candidate for the house of Caiaphas. And because of that, it is very likely the place where Jesus was dragged by the soldiers to stand before Caiaphas. The prison is cut way down in this rock. You weren't going to break through the walls to get out of that. You were in. We got in through a door, but the door is relatively recent to get the tourists in there. The way they got in and out of that prison was being lowered by guards through that hole in the roof. They didn't have very many people escaping back in those days. Paul may have been a prisoner in this room as well, I guess. Then, of course, we know that Jesus was crucified. We don't know. God hasn't preserved the memory of the place where Jesus was crucified. There's two candidates. One of them is the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, where the Roman Catholics kind of gathered together all the sites, Mount Calvary and the tomb and everything in one spot under one church building. I don't think it's very likely that that was a spot. But we don't know the real spot. There was a man named Gordon, an amateur archaeologist back in the 1800s, who said, he went around and he surveyed all these hills and places to compare what he found with what read about in the Bible. Now, when they executed a person back in those days by crucifixion, they wanted to make an example of him. So they'd put him up, way up on a cross, up above everybody, and they would put him someplace where people walking by would see him. And what better place would there be than the brow of an abrupt hill like this? But what caught the attention of Mr. Gordon was the Bible describes it as the place of a skull. And if you back up from where we are, I should have put a different picture in there. Those two holes, when you back up, look very much like a skull. The socketless eyes, or eyes, sockets that were eyeless in a skull. And that could have been the very place where Jesus was crucified. I was also reminded that, these are Jewish people that live in Palestine, although they like to have the Christians coming over and spending all that tourist money. They are not going to give in and say that Jesus was a Messiah. They don't believe the Messiah has come yet. So Jesus is an interloper to them. And it was interesting because in this spot here, if that was the place where Jesus was crucified, that would be that would have been a place that above all others Christians would gather to, I would think. There would be a big plaza before it, and there would be church buildings built around it. But the reality was there was a bus parking lot down there and a Muslim minaret down there. It was very much a Jewish country. But very near to that, there was something else that, again, we do not have any ideas connected with Jesus, the garden tomb. You go down in this little spot, way down, follow this path down there, and there is the garden tomb. It's a tomb from back in what would have been the days of Jesus, and there's a little garden around it, which is interesting because the Bible says when Jesus was buried, Joseph of Arimathea, one of the rulers of Israel, said to Jesus' disciples, "You can take him and lay him in my tomb." A new tomb, no body is ever laid in it yet. Now, the thing about tombs back then was these weren't graves where you'd put people in the ground and cover them up with dirt, and the dirt would stay there as a blanket over them. The tombs were like caves, and you would put the body in there, and then you would cover it up, roll a stone across the front, seal it off, and come back a year later, and all the flesh would be gone. There'd only be bones left. You would gather the bones up and put them in a box called an ossuary. Take up much less room. You put the box up on a shelf. They have actually found the ossuary box of Caiaphas with his name on it. But the garden tomb is laid out just like that. If you go inside the door, you can see the channel on the left where the stone would have rolled. But it's just a little cave with the entrance blocked up there. And inside there are a couple of places on either side there where you could lay a body. Lay the body out, you'd wrap it up, you'd put spices around it. Then you would seal up the tomb and then come back later and gather up the bones and put them in an ossuary box. They didn't have time to do that with Jesus. They buried him on a Friday. They had to hurry because Friday at sundown was the beginning of the Passover, and no work was to be done, and taking care of a dead body was work. So they just hurriedly put Jesus in the tomb, laid him in a spot like that, sealed up the tomb, came back after the Sabbath, which ended, of course, on Saturday evening. But early Sunday morning, the women who were taking care of the body of Jesus came back to the tomb, finding the stone already rolled away and the body was gone. They thought that his body had been taken in an act of desecration by the Romans. But Mary Magdalene, who was tarrying behind, saw a man, her eyes probably blurry from tears, saw a man who was there, and she said, "Sir," she supposed him to be the gardener, the one who took care of the garden. She said, "Can you tell us where they've taken Jesus?" Then the man spoke to her, and Mary instantly recognized the voice of Jesus. And as I said earlier, her world turned upside down. Indeed, the whole world turned upside down. That's, the resurrection of Jesus is the end of the Old Testament story and the beginning of the Christian era. The city of Jerusalem did not last long as a major Jewish center long after the days of Jesus. If the crucifixion took place around 29 AD or so, when they think it did, it was about 70 AD when the Romans came in, tired of Jewish insurrections, and obliterated the place, tore down the temple, chased all the Jews out, rebuilt a Roman city on the spot, and the Jewish presence after that wasn't an awful lot until about 1948, when the Israelis were back and became independent. But the story is still being told. It's being told through archaeology. There are so many things that have been hidden under centuries of dirt that are being uncovered, like some of the ruins that we saw. But we actually got to participate in an archaeological project ourselves. The Muslims in charge of the Temple Mount were given that privilege on the condition that they didn't change anything. But of course, they've been changing everything anyway. And one of the things they did was to dig out a whole bunch of ground, destroying a lot of archaeological evidence, to build a mosque on the temple grounds. And they just took all this, bulldozed this dirt out. You know, archaeologists like to peel back things 1 teaspoon at a time. They just took a bulldozer in and got all these piles of dirt out and dumped them. Well, the enterprising Israelis took those piles of dirt and painstakingly sifted through the, all right, my phone's trying to ring. There. Sifted through that, and they found a whole lot of evidence of Jewish occupation of the Mount and things. And they've done the same thing with some other territory. They're doing extensive archaeological work along the old city below the temple grounds. And they've kept all this dirt, and they have this building there where they let tourists come in and actually do work. You take a bucket of this dirt, put it in these things with a grating on the bottom, and then you wash the dirt away, and then you poke through those little rocks, and you find artifacts from way back in ancient days. That's my daughter-in-law Sarah there. Was taking a break from her mothering and her work as a physician's, what do you call them? Anyway, some highfalutin title. Anyway, so there's my son. They're poking through those ruins. They're finding little bits of pottery, which they can tell a lot from. You may find a fish bone that tells them what the diet was of the people back in those days, or where the fish came from, what kind of trade they had. And then they would have, when you got done poking through, a young archaeological student would come by and review your work, make sure you didn't miss anything. And then at the end of it all, the archaeologists in charge of the site showed us what we'd found. Some people found coins, some people found some special kinds of pottery, and some other kinds of very interesting experience to be able to actually participate in a very, very small way in uncovering the archaeological record that is still unveiling the story of Jesus and the story of the Israelites back in those days. As I said, they were doing extensive excavations along the old city of Jerusalem. This is a house they excavated from way back. The old city was down below the temple, and it was on a hillside, and this house was built alongside of a hill. And this house might have been thriving in the days of David and Solomon. There's another place. I said the Romans came by and obliterated everything around 70 AD. There were a couple of pockets of resistance where these Jewish revolutionaries or very religious people escaped the Romans for a time. They went out in desert places where nobody was, and they established communities. I've seen this picture many, many times, but I finally got to stand on the spot and take my own picture. This is at the place called Qumran, a cave in the hillside there. Qumran is where some of these revolutionaries were. The Essenes, a very orthodox community was. And they built all these things there, and they had water from the Dead Sea. They had to boil it to get the salt out of it. But they built houses, they built reservoirs for water. This is a scriptorium. One of the things they did was to preserve the ancient Jewish writings and books of the Bible. And they would copy them over painstakingly in this room extended to the right there. But when the Romans began to come near and they realized that they were in danger of being exterminated, they took a lot of those ancient writings, wrapped them in leather and put them in clay jars, and took them out to the hillsides in these caves right across the valley there. And they were not discovered by the Romans. They weren't discovered by anybody until I think it was 1948 when a young Arab that was looking for his goats didn't want to climb up there into that cave. I think that's the first cave. So he threw a rock up there to see if he could hear any goats up in there. He didn't hear goats, but he heard pottery breaking. Pottery meant something man-made. Something man-made could have been an antiquity, something very, very old, and something very, very old could be worth money. And all of a sudden, all these ancient writings started appearing on the black market. And the authorities knew something was up. They finally traced it down to the Arabs who were selling them. And they went through all these caves and they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Bible and other writings, the Old Testament, 2,000 years ago. And they have a museum called the Shrine of the Book, where an entire ancient copy of the book of Isaiah from way back then. The meaning of that, the importance of that, was it proved that there were things in place 2,000 years ago that things haven't changed. The text is still the same, is just as accurate. History was much, much newer. I mean, the first copies of some of these things were pushed back 1,000 years. An amazing development in proving the accuracy of the Bible. This is the last thing. This is the community of Masada. What you're looking at there are the remains of Herod's palace. He was always paranoid, I think, but he had his little hideaway out here in the wilderness where there's this mesa with valleys all around. This big rock that sticks up, it's flat-topped, and very easily defended. Walls were built around the top. You couldn't get to it except by a little narrow path. Only one way up there, so it was very, very safe. A very small number of soldiers could hold off armies of attackers. So he built his palace there. It was obviously much prettier back then with all the stucco and decorations. But when the Romans took over Jerusalem, a bunch of those Jewish revolutionaries and religious people fled to this place called Masada. And they had a community on top of this hill. And the Romans wanted desperately to destroy it. But they built buildings up there. They had crops growing up there. They collected water up there in huge cisterns. And they were able to hold out for many, many months, even though the Romans had surrounded the place. But you could look down, the sentries on the walls could look down. There's a Roman camp, 2 Roman camps. The Romans came and they built several camps around there, because they were going to capture these people. They weren't going to get away. But in order to get up there, they had to build a ramp. So as the people on top watched, the Romans, basket of dirt by basket of dirt, built this causeway you see on the left. Closer and closer, they worked behind these huge wooden machines of war until finally the people on the top knew that the next day the Romans were going to be able to break in. There wasn't going to be anything they could do to stop it. But when the Romans came the next day, there was a stillness of death. Rather than let the Romans kill them, they had committed suicide themselves. The families were killed. 10 men did the work, and then they drew lots. They've even found the lots. They drew lots, and the man whose name was drawn killed the others, and then he committed suicide. The Romans did not have the privilege of killing them. They did it themselves. Anyway, that's the end of the story there and the beginning of our story. Now that we know what happened in Palestine, we can see where it happened, see it was a real thing. The question is, what are we going to do with that? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation today. Sorry about getting started late. Thank you for your patience. Here's that picture. That's not supposed to be like that. What that picture is another spot in Israel way up in the north where when the kingdom split after Solomon, Jeroboam was the king of the north. He didn't want the Israelites going back down to Jerusalem every year, so he built a high place, an altar of sacrifice up at Dan. That's it. Right there we're looking, the very place that he built there. There's no end of surprises. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening. I hope this has been an interesting program for you. As I said earlier, we're going to next week on Wednesday, we'll begin a new program for 3 showings. It's going to be a program called The History of America in Song. I've always been impressed by how the songwriters have preserved history over the years. And there are a bunch of old songs you'll recognize, a lot of them, that tell the story of America in song. We'll look at some of those things next week, Lord willing.